of course, you're going to get this test back a week from today, if all goes well. And if all goes well, what? I will have a distribution of the grades for the class out of the 3 tests, based on the 3 tests. That takes a little work on my part, so that's the part that all, I have to not end up in the emergency room or, something like that. I have to not have a flat tire and, or engine blow up in my car or something. All right, so we're ready. Everybody understands how these tests are going to work? Is it going to look just like this? You bet. Among the functions of money is acting as a medium of exchange? True. What are the questions going to be like? I might ask a question about a medium of exchange. I might ask about storing value. I might ask about unit of account. Right? 3 functions of money. They have descriptions after them. Among the characteristics of money is being legal tender. True. False. There's a whole list of characteristics of money: portability, durability, homogeneity, divisibility, etc. I don't know, there's 7 or 8. You can come up with more. I don't know how many, whoever it was. The earliest I've seen the list was from Plato or Aristotle, and I never get these Greek guys straightened out right. But, they're ancient. This list, people have added to it over the years, but we went through a number of them. In fact, what makes money legal tender? The government says it's legal tender. So, if there are 20 goods and no unit of account, then there will be 190 prices. N equals what? 20, the number of goods. 20 times 20 minus 1 divided by 2 is 10 times 19 equals 190, right? All of you should be hoping for such a question on the test, right? Right, that's one true false, that if you know that, there's no, did he ask something, is there some word usage thing that I need to worry about? No. To raise money to spend, the government must either tax people, borrow it, or print it. True. Right? That's just the verbiage of that, the verbiage of the right-hand side of that, right? The left-hand side is what the government's using money for or spending money on. The right-hand side is the sources of money. Included in the M1 definition of money are small time deposits. False. You've got the M1 and the M2 definition of money. Again, you sort of hope for a question like that because what's true? It's just factual, right? You know. It's either wrong or right if you know. There's no real thinking required there. Gresham's law says people will hold good money and spend bad money. True. Right? That's sort of natural with everything, right? If somebody wants to borrow something of yours, what do you usually lend them? Somebody wants to borrow a bike, and you have 4 or 5 bikes at your house, which one do you give them? Crappiest one, right? Maybe it depends on how well you know them or how well they know you. Lend me this blouse. Your friend knows which one's the best one you have, or the one they admire the most. But you might prefer to lend the less good one. The aggregate supply curve can be positively sloped in the long run. False. Long run, that curve is vertical. In the long run, inflation can't cause people to be more productive. In fact, it might cause people to be less productive. In the money stock equation, B is the monetary base, is controlled by the Fed, and is positively related to the money stock. It's in the numerator. Is controlled by the Fed. Right, the Fed really controls 2 things here. And then by using the so-called interest rates that they have, the discount rate, they can influence what the bank does, but the Fed really only controls 2 things. That one's true. The members of the Board of Governors of the Fed have a 14-year term and are limited to 1 term. Right? There's a whole list of things about the Board of Governors. They're appointed by whom? The U.S. President. Because President is ambiguous when you have Reserve Bank presidents. How many are there? Yes, I said that in that question, right? No, there's 7 of them. So there are several things you can know. Again, that's a factual question. If there is a pandemic, then aggregate supply increases. False. Right? During COVID, were there more goods available or less? Less. The Fed controls the economy. False. Who controls the economy? We do, right? As an aside, what does the president do? Despite what all these political commentators who spend all day talking about politics say, what does the president do? Controls the executive branch of the government. And to his point a little bit, if you're the president of the university, how much control does he have on what I do in this class? Essentially none, really. I mean, you know, right? If the organization is big, and is the federal government big? Yeah, the president probably just controls the immediate people he appoints, and he's got to hope that they have some influence over some of the people in the bureaucracy. But of course, that leads to what? Leads to the reputation of government workers of not doing much, because some of them don't. The discount rate is set by the Board of Governors of the Fed. True. Right, if the discount rate goes up, then banks borrow less from the Fed. They might have fewer excess reserves, or the monetary base might be small. They might hold the same excess reserves. The monetary base might be smaller, but it tends to be contractionary. It reduces the amount of money in the economy. A lot of the press like to talk in terms instead affecting the discount rate, because they didn't understand this equation probably when they took their one economics class. So one thing to understand, a lot of the press, like when I was at the University of Florida in graduate school, had this big broadcasting, school, broadcast, school or major, I guess, but it's a school, they have a school of broadcasting. And those people were required to take one economics class. And you know, the guy writing about economics, and your newspaper may have started off covering, you know, writing obituaries, and then covered night court, and then switched to, you know, so they don't necessarily, you know, they probably weren't in sports. Sports seems to be separate, but, you know, they do move these people all around, and they may not have specialized in writing about business or the economy. The lags in monetary policy are shorter than the lags in fiscal policy making monetary policy less effective. Oops. I sort of snuck in something at the end. Right? That the lags are shorter means that monetary policy is more effective. Well, I don't know, I don't like that very much. I don't want you to miss something because you didn't, you know, you knew the answer but you didn't read to the end. If you go over, have a question like that in class, I encourage you to read to the end. You know. One of the dangers of going over this test is what? The dangers of giving you old tests are what? What's one of the big dangers for you?
You can alter one word and change the whole answer.
Well, it's not just that I can do that. If I write a similar question, you can read the first 3 words and think you know what the question is, and you tend to read what you think is gonna be there, or sometimes, the final exam, I want the hell out of here. You answer, you didn't read the end and you knew, right, if you just read. So it's not just, you know, you gotta be careful about, you don't wanna change just one word and change it. You don't wanna add a not and change it, or maybe you wanna make the not capital if you do that. But you know, just this whole idea of, oh, I know which that question is. And even when I was in graduate school, some people, were studying on old written exams. And so they get the written exam and go, oh, I know which that question is, you know, write this long answer. Of course, they didn't read the question. They just assumed what the question was. So you just have to be careful about that. If inflation rises, the unemployment rate falls.
True.
That is false. So, if dynamic aggregate supply falls, what happens to the inflation rate? It goes up. Since GDP growth is slowing, what's happening to the unemployment rate? It's increasing. So all it takes is one counterexample to make a true false. So it's a counterexample that you know. If the economy is growing more slowly, the unemployment rate goes up. If there's an aggregate supply shock, that causes a negative aggregate supply shock, that causes inflation to go up. There are a lot of people who will write in the press like this statement is true. Depends on whether you're getting supply shocks or demand shocks. If the demand shock, if it's positive demand shock, then inflation goes up and growth goes up, unemployment may go down.
I was kind of looking at it on the basis of if inflation's higher, prices are going up, more people are gonna try and get jobs because they can't live on this one income anymore.
Right, a lot of people, but, you know, somebody getting a separate, if somebody taking a second job doesn't lead to more, it doesn't lead to less unemployment. Or you working more in your job doesn't lead to less unemployment. So maybe that's a problem with the unemployment data.
If prices of supplies go up, then they're gonna have to cut workers.
oil price shock, right? It's not that they have to cut workers, it's that they can't sell it for the price that they could sell it for before because the cost of production is higher. Which means, and of course, it's gonna lead to they're cutting workers because at the higher price, fewer people can buy. At the higher inflation rate, more goods are gonna be out of your ability to buy. Increases in uncertainty that slow irreversible investments make recessions worse. Oh wait, what did I?
You said 14 was false.
14 is false, yeah. So, increases in uncertainty that slow irreversible investments make recessions worse. True. Now, this is a promise I made to you, right? Or at least I hinted at. Right? Chapter 14 is about some pretty complex things, these transmission mechanisms. I said I'd probably ask one question, that's it. The question might have been people budget economic activity during when they're most productive, making expansions bigger, making recessions worse, or collateral values change in such a way as to make recessions worse and expansions bigger, and you know, those types of things. So study those, and there's like 4 or 5 of them. All right. Now, figure 1 is quite easy on this test. I think it's going to be figure 3 on your test, the way it's set up. But the bank in figure 1 can make an additional loan of at least what? At most what? Sorry. How much can they lend out?
80,000.
80,000. Why is that?
Because their required reserve is 20,000, so they have to have at least 20,000.
They have to have the 20,000. That means the required reserve ratio is what? 20% rather than 10% in the example in class. That seemed to be a real problem last semester when I was going over this, right? You need to look and see, you know, some of the good numbers I can use are 10%, 20%, 25%. For multiple choice, 1/3 is less good, you know, because we've got this extra penny out here, or we've got this rounding situation. And, you know, I guess I could make them 5%. Well, I've made it 5% on the test. But anyway, you need to be able to calculate. And the way you calculate it is you just take the liabilities, right? If I was going to change this example, if I made the deposits $500,000, then the required reserves would be 100,000, and the excess reserves would be 400,000, right? If 20% of 500,000 is 100,000, right? So you just have to look at the structure of these. If people hold no cash, banks hold no excess reserves, and the bank in figure 1 is the only bank, then it will expand deposits to what? What will deposits end up? Well, let's see. They have $100,000 in cash divided by what? 1/5. 5/1 over 501, so the number doesn't change, and we get 500,000. And 500,000 is C. So yes, C. I know, that's a long way to get there, but. Now, 18 is really easy. And some of your colleagues who weren't here might miss this, but if people hold no cash, banks hold no excess reserves, and the bank in figure 1 is the only bank, it will eventually hold required reserves of what? 100,000, whatever the cash is. Right? Excess reserves have to be cash. Required reserves have to be cash. Among the functions of a central bank are controlling the economy, paying for government spending, acting as a lender of last resort during a banking panic. All the above. What do we think?
I'm thinking C.
Yeah, do they control the economy? We just said no a second ago. You could criticize me for sort of having that question twice on the test. Although, being Americans exposed to the American press, you might think, the American press who did poorly in their one economics class seems to think the central bank controls the economy when they don't. Do they pay for government spending? No, that's a bad thing if they're paying for government spending. In fact, in the US, it's illegal. I haven't said this in class, and I won't ask a question on it. But the Treasury can't directly sell the bonds to the Fed. They have to go be sold to the public, and then the Fed can buy them up, because we don't want printing money to pay for government spending. Among the voting members of the Federal Open Market Committee are the members of the Board of Governors, the Comptroller of the Currency, the Secretary of the Treasury. These sound like really good answers, don't they? What is it? A. The other guys sound like they should be on there, but that's not the way the U.S. is. Of course, in general, it's sort of not the way any country is, but if you go to Japan or you go to England, go to the UK, whoever, they don't have a board of governors like we have. They have but the central bank is a department of the Treasury Department. So they would work for the Secretary of Treasury, but that's not the way it's set up in the U.S. As I said, we don't like centralized power. Among the voting members of the Federal Open Market Committee, oh wait, that's it. That's the one we just did. All right. So, when you go to answer these graphical questions, what do you think you should do? It won't hurt to draw on the graphs. Although I would advise drawing on them in pencil so you can erase what you have. All right. If the Fed increases the growth rate of money, what happens in this graph? You don't really have to draw out this one. What happens if the Fed increases the growth rate of money? Aggregate demand increases. So dynamic aggregate demand. If you said aggregate supply increases, you're saying printing green pieces of paper causes more land, labor, or capital somehow. If aggregate demand is decreased, then what happens? Inflation rate rises, the inflation rate falls, aggregate supply rises, aggregate supply falls.
Aggregate supply falls.
Aggregate, well, I just drew a decrease, what happens? Did aggregate supply move?
No, because it is in line, so yeah, it wouldn't move.
Yeah, so all that happened was inflation fell. So the inflation rate falls. And as I said, you should maybe make it so you can erase it on test day. Because the next question is, if aggregate supply increases, you were right after all. You're much too smart to be in this class. You didn't need to bother with this class, and you go out as soon as you get done with this class and you invent something. A new computer chip, something that helps a lot of different things in the economy. Aggregate supply increases, and what happens?
Aggregate demand falls.
No, aggregate demand stayed the same, but the inflation rate fell and aggregate supply, the inflation rate fell and the GDP growth rate went up. This is sort of that quantity, they don't really use it here, but it's sort of that shift in supply versus, if this were just demand, you'd never say demand fell. You're moving down the curve. So it's sort of the same type of thing.
So just kind of, if we see that line on the test, just think that as kind of a constant almost.
Well, this one you can sort of think is a constant, but it depends on what shifts. So in this case, aggregate supply shifted to the right, it increased. Did I do it right? If aggregate supply increases, and that causes the inflation rate to fall and real GDP growth to rise. So really what you need to do is, when you get to the answers, then you don't have to worry about that in anything else. All you have to say is, well, what happened to inflation and what happened to GDP growth, and you have to have shifted aggregate supply to the right. You have to know that for an increase. To increase aggregate supply, the government could increase patent length, decrease R&D subsidies, increase government spending. A. Decreasing R&D spending would reduce aggregate supply. Government spending affects aggregate demand. To increase aggregate demand, the government could increase the growth of taxes, decrease government spending growth, increase the money supply growth rate. C. If I had said decrease the growth of taxes, increase the government spending growth, then the answer would have been all the above, right? You switch both of those. Because all three of those things do affect aggregate demand. In 24, I put in something that affects aggregate demand rather than aggregate supply. All right, so to increase aggregate supply, the government could slow regulation growth, increase the money supply, increase government spending. Slow regulation growth, B and C are things that affect aggregate demand. So you need to be able to separate them out. And the tricky one is what? If you lower tax rates, aggregate supply increases. If you lower taxes, overall taxes, aggregate demand increases. That's the tricky one. You have to distinguish the rate versus the amount. Aggregate supply may be positively sloped due to GDP growth, sticky prices, growing inflation. What do we think? these sticky prices. I don't know what's on this other test, but aggregate supply may be positively sloped due to contracts, sticky prices, menu costs. Aggregate supply may be positively sloped due to contracts, wages not quickly adjusting to changes in the economy, menu cost. Both of those last two are all the above, right? Another way to say sticky prices is some kind of price or wage. Wage is just a price that doesn't quickly adjust to a change in the economy. That's what sticky means. To increase aggregate demand, the central bank could lower the discount rate, lower the required reserve ratio, or ratios, buy bonds on the open market. What do we think? The good thing about an all the above is you weren't wrong if you said A, you just got the wrong answer for the test. You were correct that A would do it, but all of them will do it, right? Lower the discount rate causes banks to borrow more from the Fed, less from each other. Lower the required reserve ratio, it's right there in the denominator of the money stock equation. Buy bonds on the open market, the government is putting monetary base in the economy and taking bonds out. If the government decreases tax rates, then aggregate demand increases, aggregate demand decreases, aggregate supply increases, aggregate supply decreases. Tax rates affect supply.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Let me write that down. So I went to tutoring before this, and he said that it also could have been A, and to ask you why you didn't specifically, like why you would.
Because he's failing to distinguish between tax rates and taxes.
Tax rates.
Taxes, the tax receipts, the amount the government takes, right? If the government takes $10 from you, what's true about your wage?
$10 less.
Nope,
No, your
the
watch
same.
says the same.
Everything in the economy stays the same. All the prices are the same. Everything's exactly the same. The government just took $10 from you. That affects your ability to spend. You buy $10 less of things. If the government says, we're gonna raise your income tax by 10 points, so that rather than taking 15% of your money, we're taking 25% of your money, what happens to your spending? Yeah, it might stay the same. You might work harder. But you might work less. But it affects your trade-off, right? It says, if you're a mom, well, every hour that I work, I'm away from my kid, I get less, right? That's not so good. Maybe I'll work, maybe not. It says, depends on how noisy your kid is, right? How colicky. So yeah, it affects your incentives. Right? All of you could do what? How many of you have a job? Yeah. The government raises tax rates on you. You could quit your job, borrow more, study hard, do better, get into the Harvard MBA program, or get into some really fancy program because you studied well, and make a lot more money in your life, right? So it affects your incentives. It changes how you behave. The government taking $10 from you, or $1,000, or whatever, just takes it. That affects how much money you can spend. But that is the trickiest distinction, that those tax rates affect your behavior, in terms of how much you work, and taxes, the money that the government takes out of your pocket affects how much money you have to spend. If aggregate supply decreases, then the inflation rate, well, that's really, oh, I guess that's the opposite question to the one I asked before. And notice in this one, having a pencil wouldn't have been as good because we only ended up drawing one new, the questions were such. But still, if I had two, it can get confusing if you don't erase the first shift, because you gotta remember you're dealing with aggregate demand one. And in our case here, we see that if aggregate supply decreases, then the inflation rate rises and real GDP growth falls. So this is in some sense the harder, conceptually harder things in this class. I try to keep it simple. You can amplify, complicate all this stuff. But in essence, right, if you're voting for people that make the economy less productive, what's true? Then you're voting for a smaller economy. If you're like Japan and having fewer and fewer kids, such that I think Japanese population fell about 500,000 last year. Chinese population's falling too. But if you have, what do you got to do? What's going to happen if your population falls?
Demand's gonna fall.
Well, demand's going to fall, but also a supply.
Because you're not gonna have enough people.
Particularly if your population falls as you age, then your choices are what? Well, you either bring in immigrants, which the Japanese don't like to do, they have very derogatory terms for us, non-Japanese, or you do with less goods, or you start having more babies. And the baby thing takes a while to have an effect, or you work longer, right? And of course that's what happens, as health improves, people do work longer. So there is some of that. All right, so you guys are ready.